Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, brought to you today by Josh Edison and Dr. M. Dentith. Hello and welcome to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. I am Josh Edison, as ever sharing a sofa and who knows what else.
Syphilis?
Dr. M. RX Dentith. I don't know. Your eye is looking quite a bit better there, I have to say.
Well, the makeup helps, but yes, I am in recovery mode. I am much better.
That's the only thing that matters.
The problem with modern medical care, Joshua, the problem with modern medical care is that doctors are so much better at stitching these days, so you don't actually get visible scars if your doctor is doing a good job. Doing a good job. And unfortunately, I went to a good doctor, so it's very unlikely.
That was your first mistake.
Very unlikely I'll have a scar.
I was so disappointed. I got whacked by a thing last year that went right, sort of, hit my brow and then my cheek and gave me a perfect line down there. But I didn't whack myself hard enough, unfortunately. No cool scar. It would have been a really good one if it had stayed in that spot.
Josh, you should always whack yourself hard.
Well, yes, now I know. Now, I understand this is no longer the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, it's the Podcaster's Guide to 5G technology, now that you're an expert in that field.
It's true. I was in the spin-off this week, which for those of you who don't live in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is a... How would you describe the spin-off? Sort of
an online magazine, sort of leftish leaning, but bit of entertainment, bit of news, bit of current events.
I have to say it's a website for the bourgeoisie, but anyway.
Same thing.
I was asked to pass comment on 5G conspiracy theories for a column by the ever great Emily Wrights. I wrote some responses. She used them. I am now an expert on 5G and 5G conspiracy theories. We should actually probably do the 5G conspiracy theories.
Because it's kind of...
Given I'm now a world expert.
It's kind of becoming the new 1080 in New Zealand, at least, isn't it?
It very much is.
The latest thing that everyone...
Although it is also the cell phones cause cancer of the 1990s.
Right, yes. Yeah, no, that is something we should get into. That's not what we're getting into today. We're still on our pseudoscientific kick. I was a little bit outraged, I have to say, when you first proposed this topic and sent me a link to Japhetic theory, which is what we're going to be talking about, and I discovered it's we had a read through a Soviet linguistics theory and realised you've been holding out on me. We could have been talking linguistics for who knows how long.
I like a slow burn. See, this podcast is the NCIS of podcasts. Now, you might think, that's a really weird thing to say about any podcast, but let me tell you about NCIS.
It's the most popular show in the States, isn't it?
It is, and it's been going on now for 15 years. Dang. This year will be the 15th season. And despite the fact it's really old, they have been parceling out plot points and character development for the main characters slowly but surely over the course of a decade and a half. And that's what I'm doing with this podcast, right. Joshua. I am keeping some of the really, really creme de la creme conspiracy theories for the middle age of the podcast so that we still appear to be vital and essential to podcast listeners out there.
Brilliant. But also at the same time, bumbling and incompetent, as we have two actual updates and retractions to do.
And we've got a sting for that, so let's use that sting to justify the updates and the retractions.
Updates and retractions.
Right, so we have a correction apiece this week. Who wants to go first?
I shall go first.
Okay, please do.
Because this is the embarrassing part. In last week's episode, we talked about Nazi pseudoscience, and we talked about the occultic nature of much Nazi belief. We also put this belief down to one Heinrich Himmler. Now, I say this with all due seriousness, but we apologise to the family of Heinrich Himmler for labelling him as an occultic lunatic.
I'm pretty sure he was, though. But not the specific occultic lunatic.
The specific one we should have been talking about was Rudolf Hess. It was Rudolf Hess who was, of course, fascinated by the occult. It was Rudolf Hess who was summoned to Scotland by, apparently, Aleister Crowley. It was, in fact, Rudolf Hess we should have been mentioning. So apologies to the family of Heinrich Himmler. we should have been making fun of Hess instead.
I mean, to be fair, Himmler was the one behind the Ahnenerbe that we were talking about mostly last week, but the specific story about people being summoned to England by Aleister Crowley's
Was very
Gothic
Hessian
powers was, in fact, it should have been
not
Hess. So,
Himmlerian.
so thank you to Mike, astute listener, who sent in that correction.
Who has forced us to apologise to the family of Heinrich Himmler. I hope you're happy now.
I assume he is. So my turn. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we had our news article episode, and the top story was the fun of the missing bodies in the Vatican cemetery. Now, I got the wrong end of the stick a little bit when reading up one of these articles. It was sort of... It talked about these ossuaries which they had found bones in which they were testing to be the princesses, but the way the article was written, and I assume it was like the Catholic Times or something, so they probably assumed that its readers would know the fine details of Teutonic cemeteries in the Vatican, but I did not. So basically, when they were talking about two princesses and finding two ossuaries, I had made the connection that they were little things, each of which containing the bones of a princess. I was completely wrong. What had actually been found, these two ossuaries, were gigantic freaking vaults underneath one of these bits in the cemetery, containing lots and lots and lots of bones. So when, as we talked about, they'd been doing a bunch of reconstructing of that area of the cemetery, they'd obviously basically gathered up all the bones and just dumped them in a pit, essentially, as a nice pit from the sounds of things. But
a fancy pit.
A fancy pit.
For fancy bones.
But a bone pit nonetheless. So rather than having two sets of bones that they're testing for DNA, they have thousands upon thousands of bones, which they're going to be sifting through for quite some time, I imagine, trying to figure out which bones belong with which. And then they talk about there are fragments of bones as well, so obviously a bunch of them have broken into little pieces and so on. So while I'd assumed it would be an easy task to find out whether or not the bones they had belonged to these princesses whose bodies had gone missing, possibly it will not be.
In fact, you can imagine a situation where they go, so we've found more than one potential match for a princess of that realm, because it turns out that maybe their parents had been a little bit more fickle than we thought they were, because there are a lot of people with genetic matches here, an awful lot of people.
And all that 17th century medieval noblery inbreeding that I assume went on.
That's why they all had noses, apart from the ones who didn't.
Anyway, so that was a good excuse to use the little sting, I thought. But we're at the end now of our updates and retractions. We have nothing more to retract.
So instead, let us return back to Soviet Russia and the fun of Soviet linguistics. So Joshua, you like linguistics.
I do.
You also like linguini.
It's not bad. I
And
prefer
you like-
linguistics.
You like vodka and Russian orthodoxy?
No.
Well, then this theory is not going to be for you.
Well, it is a little bit, I think. We're talking about Japhetic theory. This is kind of going to be a bit of a repeat of the Lysenko episode, in that we're going to be looking at another wacky Soviet pseudoscientific theory that kind of found favour by being the right kind of science, by being nicely sort of communistic in nature. But it's an interesting story. I think it's an interesting story anyway, because I do like me some linguistics. So we should probably start by saying what it actually was. Japhetic theory was a linguistic theory promoted by a fellow. Now, I've seen several articles, and in each one they give him a different last letter of his name. And some they call him Nicolas, and some he's Nicolaj, and some he's Nicolai. I don't know if that's just the language of that region puts different letters on the end of your name in different contexts or whatever.
Or just very bad transliterations.
Or very bad transliterations, but we'll stick with Nicolas. Nicolas Yakovlevich Mar. He was a historian. He was a linguist in the early part of the 1900s. By all accounts, he was quite a good one. He was a noted expert. He was from the sort of from Georgia, basically around that area. I think Georgian was his native tongue, and he was quite an expert in the history of the Georgian language. But then he started to branch out. And he came up with this idea that there was a family of languages called Japhetic languages. This is named after Japheth, one of Noah's sons in the Bible, because you have Semitic peoples and Semitic languages. That comes from Shem. There was also, apparently, there used to be a family of languages called Hamitic after Noah's son Ham, although supposedly that categorization no longer applies. People don't think that's a real one. So we just sort of have the term Semitic. But he proposed this idea of Japhetic as companions to Semitic and Hamitic languages. And specifically, he thought that Japhetic languages were a family of languages that included the what are called Kartvelian languages, which were languages kind of from the Caucasus region around where he was, which included Georgian and a bunch of other ones, and also a bunch of Semitic languages such as Arabic and Hebrew and Aramaic and so on, which are found in the Middle East. And straight away, that does seem a little bit odd that we've got sort of North Caucasus region and Middle East region, which should actually be like that, I suppose. If I'm holding, for the podcast listeners, I'm holding my hands up in what I assume are roughly the relative positions of those two areas of the world. Probably completely wrong, but anyway.
And also looking like you're about to do something
like I'm about to pounce at the camera. Yes. The point is, though, there's a bit of a gap in between. In fact, there's quite a gap in between the two. So it does seem a little bit odd right off the bat. That you'd want to claim that you have this family of languages that appear to be localized to two quite separate areas of the world. But nevertheless, that's what he thought. He thought he could prove this. I don't know. And his theories kind of grew from there. He talked about the idea that all the languages in the world could be descended from a single proto-language, and that there were sort of strata. I think he was a bit of an archaeologist himself, so he was sort of thinking in slightly archaeological terms, where you'd have these strata of languages with sort of the older proto-languages deeper down, and then the more recent ones up and up and up. So Japhetic being sort of a strata below the modern day languages of those two areas, given that they sort of came from this one family. And then from there, he sort of went to say that these language strata also corresponded to social strata, and that certain social classes were more related to certain language strata. And that's where Stalin and the socialists and the communists started to stand up and pay attention, because they were very much into their class consciousness and what have you, weren't they?
Yes, and indeed this is where the imaging of Lysenkoism becomes so obvious, in that Lysenkoism became popular because Stalin liked Lysenko and Lysenko's theories. In the same respect, Stalin liked Ma and Ma's theories. So by having endorsement basically by the chairperson of the committee, these things became the orthodox science of the realm. Although what's interesting about Japhetics, as opposed to Lysenkoism, is that Lysenkoism dies after Stalin. The Japhetic theory, not so much.
Yes.
But we'll get to that.
We'll get to that.
We'll get to that in just a minute.
So, I mean, it's interesting as a little sort of side note and a callback to last week's episode about Nazi pseudoscience. Apparently, Ma was quite sort of passionate in his beliefs and was quite strongly opposed to a bunch of German linguists at the time, who, from the sounds of things, were sort of embarking on a similar project to the Ahnenerbe, while the Ahnenerbe were looking for archaeological proof of sort of the lineage of the Germanic people. These linguists were looking for linguistic proof, trying to trace the languages back to sort of show this same sort of lineage they were after. And he was apparently very, very much opposed to them. Among other things, he thought they overemphasized the Christian influence in European sort of language and history, and significantly underemphasized the Muslim influence from North Africa and the Middle East and so on. And he was possibly a little bit on the money there, but
And in the same respect that we talked last week about how the cultural diffusion angle the Germans had at that time, trying to find some kind of global source to justify Aryan supremacy, in the way that Ma is doing the same thing linguistically to show that there's a tight relationship between his region of the world and another important region of the world. This continues to this day. So you've got pseudolinguistics when it comes to people who claim that, say, the Celts got here. Because it turns out when you actually investigate the Celtic New Zealand thesis, it turns out the Celts got here because Greek and Egyptian navigators got here. there's a kind of disconnect here between Egypt, Greece, and Celtic England, but that gets left to one side. And they'll go, well, the proof positive of that is that the Egyptian word for sun is Ra. The Polynesian word for sun is
Ra.
Must be the same language, or at least share the same language root. Although, as any linguist worth their salt will point out, the problem with linguistics and comparative linguistics is that actually the human mouth is only capable of making a very small selection of sounds. And very simple terms, or simple words for things, tend to actually have a high degree of resemblance across languages because we tend to use very simple sounds for everyday things. So it's actually not unusual that two completely unrelated cultures would share the same word for something which was so central to their lives, the sun.
And I mean, even just statistically, if we call out that comparison because it's striking to us, but there have been tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of different languages across the world and across history. So the fact that you can find two of them that are completely unrelated but happen to use the same term is just sort of, is well within the realms of statistics.
Yeah. But that's because humans are bad at estimating probabilities.
Well, we are. I mean, a note on the idea of sort of proto-languages and going back. As I understand it, there is a genuine project in linguistics to try and sort of reconstruct the proto-languages. When it's clear that you have a family of languages that all come from a common source, and you have some idea of how those languages have changed over time, you can then sort of extrapolate backwards and try and sort of work out, well, the language that these ones will descended from must have sounded a bit like this. We know that these sounds changed in this way and these word forms changed in this way. So if we sort of work the change backwards and then keep going, we can have an idea of the sort of, some sort of proto-Indo-European language or something. But there is a lot of educated guesswork involved. There's a lot of, well, probably, assuming this, and if we assume that nothing happened in between and so on. So it is all quite dodgy. And it's also, the absolute best we can do is basically go back one generation into the past. There's just no way of going any further than that. You can take existing languages, maybe work back from there, but then that's so hypothetical that even going another layer back. And so if you want to talk about, how long have humans been around? A couple of 100,000 years talking at least, and yet recorded history is maybe a few thousand. So yeah, when it comes to talk of proto-languages, if anyone tries to tell you that that we know the common language from which all other ones evolved, they're telling you pork pies.
Although it didn't stop, say, the ancient Egyptians from trying to work out what the first language was.
Well, yes, I think it's a common.
And I mean, there's a famous
project.
story about that, although I think the story itself is actually largely apocryphal and actually is found in a lot of different cultures. But the idea of putting children in a tower, and they just leave them alone to see what language they will naturally speak, and they come back several years later, and the children are making these kind of guttural bah-like sounds. That sounds a lot like insert language here, so Babylonian, Sumerian. We've discovered the first languages, and then someone looks out the window and goes, "What's that down there? Are those sheep?"
Yes, I have heard that story before, and almost certainly apocryphal, but it probably does illustrate an interesting point.
But I mean, it also speaks to the fact that cats, by and large, don't make noises except around humans, because they've kind of learnt that we communicate not through the laying of scents and rubbing ourselves against furniture the entire time. We do it by making noise, and cats are clever enough to go, noise making is obviously pretty important. I'm going to screech a lot from now on in.
Yes. Anyway, returning to your Japhetic language theories.
And away from cats.
And away from cats for now. So it all sort of, it tied in nicely with a lot of Stalin's ideas about nationality and language's relationship to it. And I have to be honest, reading through articles about this, I got a little bit lost. You'll be surprised to hear that the intricacies of Stalin's socialist theory eluded me a little bit. But there's a lot of talk of national identities, whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, how things should work, whether it would be good for all nationalities to come together, or whether or not they should, cultural areas should retain their identity and uniqueness and so on. And quite frankly, it seems to seesaw between the two a lot of time.
Well, I mean, it kind of fits in with the notion of Soviet or social realism, which takes it that class is a real thing, but not necessarily other things associated with class. So in theory, if you get everyone to speak the same language, then you can kind of unify them in a class-based society, and thus ethnicity doesn't matter. Except that, of course, sometimes it does, because someone like Stalin, who comes from a particular region of the world, wants his particular origin space to still be important. And so there's a certain amount of what we might call inconsistency when a despot is running a country and making things up as he goes along. As we saw with Lysenkoism, and we're going to see with Japhetic theory, endorsing something doesn't make it true, but it does fit an agenda.
Yes, so, I mean, part of Ma's theories was that languages tended to fuse together into a single nice communist-y language. Apparently, now this is where the class consciousness comes in. Apparently there was a campaign in the 20s and 30s to actually, what's the word? Not introduce, mandate? That's not quite the word either, but specifically specify which alphabets certain ethnicities should be using for their languages, so that supposedly smaller ethnicities were encouraged to adopt a Latin alphabet of the kind that we use, replacing the Cyrillic alphabets that they use and which the other larger ethnicities use. And I think that was possibly part of, related to the idea of different classes relating to different language strata and trying to sort of separate them more clearly. But it does get a little bit funny. I mean, to be fair, language and politics do intersect. I mean, there's a lot of sort of the identity politics side of things, and the policing of language, as some would say it, and the freedom of speech, and the you can't say that sort of type arguments. But entirely apart from that, language and nationality are sort of closely tied. And
as we see with France.
Yeah. And I mean, they particularly get into it with the what is it called, the Académie Française or whatever.
The 100 Immortals.
And then similarly in French Canada as well, but all across the world, there's this line that I remember I heard a lot when I was doing linguistics at university. They'd say a language is a dialect with guns, which I believe is a simplification of an earlier quote, which is a language is a dialect with an army and navy. But what they mean is that a lot of the time, whether you have two separate languages or two dialects of the same language depends on whether or not the speakers of those languages wish to identify themselves as separate or together. So you get all over Europe, and I assume all over the rest of the world as well, you often get places where you'll have two neighbouring regions, and the languages that they speak certainly sound very similar to a third party, and yet they'll insist, oh, no, we've got completely separate languages. What's that guy talking? I had no idea what I can't even understand the guy. Because they want to remain separate. And then you get places like China, say, where there are a bunch of different families of languages, some of which are very dissimilar to the point of mutual unintelligibility, but it suits China to say that they're all, it's all one language because they want to be all one country. So, like, Stalin's not completely talking out of his arse when he wants to tie the concepts of language and nationality together. It's just exactly how he does it.
No, actually, there's a nice Romanian example here. So, Romanian is taken to be the last Latin-derived language that's still spoken to this day. But what's interesting about this is it's a lot more Latin now than it was 130 years ago. 130 years ago, the language had a lot more Slav in it and sounded a lot more Slavic. The people at the time wanted to distinguish themselves from their Slavic-speaking neighbours, so they engaged in a program to basically emphasize the Latin in Romanian and try to remove a lot of the loan words. And it was a very successful project. Romanian was re-Latinized, which is, as most linguists will point out, kind of unheard of. Normally, government edicts to change a language or preserve it doesn't work because people simply speak the language they want to.
There has to be buy-in.
And that's the problem with the French example. The French government is going to great lengths to stop loanwords from being used in everyday French. It isn't working.
You can just ignore them.
You can insist for official documentation, but what you can't do is stop people from referring to burgers as burgers, whether they contain meat or entirely made of vegetables, when they go to the supermarket.
Yeah, I mean, that was, again, from my distant memories of linguistics lectures, that the French example was held up in contrast to the Kohanga Reo organisation in New Zealand, which was very much grassroots. And that was very successful. That did sort of revitalise the Maori language to an extent, because it came from the people, and it had buy-in from the start, whereas French, it's being imposed from the top. But I assume the people were on board with what the government was doing.
So, how well did this Japhetic theory actually work in Soviet Russia?
Well, I mean, in terms of its popularity and how especially Mr. Ma got on, we see a lot of similarity with what happened to Lysenko, where Lysenko was given, what did they make him? The head of...
The head of the agricultural sciences.
Agricultural sciences.
The institute thereof.
So Ma, he managed the National Library of Russia. He managed the Japhetic Institute of the Academy of Sciences from 1921 until he died in 1934. He was elected vice president of the Soviet Academy of the Sciences in 1930. So again, we see a person promoting a theory that finds favour with Stalin, finds quite a lot of success. Now, as you said before, Lysenkoism kind of fell out of favour after Stalin was out of the picture. Japhetic theory fell out of favour after Ma was out of the picture, but not Stalin. So apparently Stalin himself ended up basically disowning this theory. So there was disagreement. It wasn't like, from what I gather, it wasn't quite like with Lysenko, where you were not allowed to criticise or disagree. There was still disagreement in linguistic circles. And eventually proponents, or opponents rather, of Ma's theories kind of got Stalin's ear from the sound of things. And eventually in 1950 there was, now they always say, an anti-Maoist article signed by Joseph Stalin. So I don't know if that means Stalin himself actually wrote it. He certainly put his name on it, but I don't know if it was one of these competitors.
It's very
to
strongly suggested that Stalin would sign anything that went across his table.
So a paper came out criticising Maoism and Japhetic theory, and Stalin's name was on it, and so just like that, Japhetic theory was out. And it's interesting to see actually that the paper itself, there's a quote here, Inya Ma introduced into linguistics another and also incorrect and non-Marxist formula regarding the class character of language, and got himself into a muddle and put linguistics into a muddle. Soviet linguistics cannot be advanced on the basis of an incorrect formula which is contrary to the whole course of the history of peoples and languages. So now it's anti-Marxist, his theory, which originally was so nicely communistic that it found favour. Just goes to show how the winds of thing can change and do stuff.
Now, what's the conspiracy angle here?
It's kind of the same as Lysenko, really. You have a theory which is being promoted for political reasons, not because it's necessarily good science. The politics precedes the science, when we would hope it was the other way around. Mata climate change and so on and so forth.
Clean coal. Yes, actually, because that's the point I want to make. Once again, as I said with the Lysenkoism thing, people go, oh, this is an obvious thing that was wrong with communism. Look at how it abuses science for political gain. These are problems we find with capitalism as well. Clean coal, the thing that Donald Trump goes on about all the time. Something that's been promoted by the conservatives, aka the Republicans in the US. A kind of magical substance which allows you to burn coal but not burn the planet at the same time. It's a politically useful thesis with very little grounding in actual science. Turns out politicians utilize theories like this all the time to get to the grassroots activism that keeps them afloat.
And I mean, you don't need to look at, you don't need to get into tinfoil hat theory when you're talking about these sorts of conspiracies. We know, we have documented evidence that, say, petroleum companies knew about global warming decades in advance of it becoming into the public eye. And tobacco companies
knew about the link between smoking and lung cancer for decades before being forced to admit it in front of, I'm about to say the White House, actually, I think it was more Congress, but before august bodies.
Yes. Yes, so I mean, this is basically the same thing we see today. I believe at the time, sort of when Japhetic theory, Stalin snapped his fingers and Japhetic theory was gone, in the West people would say, look at that, there's old bloody Stalin, that's your socialism for you. The guy at the top just says the word and suddenly science changes completely. I mean, in this instance he was right, basically. Japhetic theory does appear to be complete nonsense, but it still certainly raised eyebrows the way the official science of a country could just turn on a dime simply because the fellow at the top said so.
That's Stalin, one of the world's greatest linguists. That's what I'm taking from that.
Well, I assume, yes. So, I mean, we're kind of at the end of it again. We kind of ended in the same place as we did with the Lysenko one. It's interesting to look at the kind of ideas people come up with, but it's part of a pattern, I guess, of science or rather pseudoscience, in this case pseudolinguistics, as propaganda. I mean, there's in the case of linguistics is less of a hard science, I suppose, than evolution or something like that. There is a lot of languages are much more.
There'll be some linguists out there who will be very disappointed by your saying that, even though you're right.
There's a lot of sort of, mathematics to linguistics and hard data and so on, but languages are much more malleable. They're not laws of nature. There are lots of laws of linguistics we can come up with to explain the things we see, but there are always distinctions and exceptions and so on and so forth. So that you have more wiggle room to come up with pseudoscientific bollocks, I suppose, when it comes to linguistics. But pseudoscientific bollocks are still pseudoscientific bollocks, and that's all I have to say on the matter.
And I agree. Now, for those of you who aren't patrons, this will be the end of the episode.
It will.
But for those of you who are patrons, there's exciting bonus content coming up in the Patron Bonus Special, where I'll be talking about a roundtable which I appeared in, but didn't say much in. We'll have a little bit of a discussion about possible Chinese government interference with the workings at AUT, or is it? The Majestic 12 documents, which have been doing the rounds recently, may have been the product of a Russian disinformation campaign.
Those wacky Russians.
And finally, a final update on the whale oil blog.
But if you want to know more, you'll have to tune in to the Patron bonus episode. And if you want to tune into the penis bonus? Penis Botron?
The heinous Patron bonus episode.
The bonus patron episode, not the penis Botron, which I think was Secretary General of the United Nations for a while.
I am Botron.
The patron bonus episode.
Robot.
To access one of those things, you will need to be a patron. And if you are, thank you very much.
And if you are Botron,
please do not destroy us. Yes. And if you'd like to be a patron, then you can. Frankly, we were not going to stop you at all and would indeed encourage you to do so by directing you towards our patronage campaign on Patreon or the native patronage campaign at podbean.com where this podcast is hosted. But that's not naked capitalism. Or is it? We do have a lot of communism to balance out from the rest of this episode. But I think that's all I can stand.
Frankly, I think there's only one more thing to say. All hail Botron.
All hail Botron.
All hail. You've been listening to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, starring Josh Addison and Dr. M.R. Extended, which is written, researched, recorded, and produced by Josh and M. You can support the podcast by becoming a patron via its Podbean or Patreon campaigns. And if you need to get in contact with either Josh or M, you can email them at podcastconspiracy@gmail.com or check their Twitter accounts, Monkey Fluids and Conspiracism.
And remember, they're coming to get you, Barbara.